The 7-year-old girl with dark hair plastered to her fever-bright face stumbled through the October cold, barefoot on cracked pavement, wearing only a thin nightgown soaked through with sweat, her lips blue and breath coming in wet, rattling gasps. Aria Hartley didn't think. She moved. The child collapsed against the iron fence outside the Langford mansion, her small body folding like paper. Aria caught her, felt the burning fever radiating through the soaked fabric, and in that moment everything else, the $5 in her pocket, the eviction notice with red ink numbers, the 12 days she had left before the world swallowed her whole, disappeared into nothing. She recognized Emma. The dark eyes, the small scar on her left cheekbone, the way her fingers curled when she was scared. Emma came to the homeless shelter on Aria's single afternoon off each week, one of 15 children sleeping on donated cots in a converted basement, one of the invisible children that nobody else bothered to name. But Aria had named her? Had braided her hair? Had whispered that she would be okay, even when both of them knew it was a lie. But Emma was not supposed to be here. Not in this neighborhood. Not outside the penthouse where Aria worked 14-hour days as a nanny to Sophie Langford's ungrateful children, cleaning their marble floors and pretending not to see the contempt in their eyes. Aria's hand found the child's forehead. The temperature was there, burning through skin like a coal. 104.3 degrees, she estimated, using the only medical knowledge she possessed, the memory of her mother's hand, 18 years dead, checking her own fever the same way. Emma's breath came in wet, rattling gasps, pneumonia settling into her lungs like an unwanted guest. Her pulse raced beneath Aria's fingers, fast as a hummingbird's wings. The October wind tore through the street like a blade wrapped in ice, cutting through Aria's threadbare coat, and she made the decision in one heartbeat. Not a choice, really. Something older than choice. She gathered Emma into her arms, feeling the child's weight, so small, so light, like holding a bundle of broken birds, and moved toward the service entrance. Her hands shook as she punched the code into the lock. 4732. The Langfords' birth years, because Sophie was predictable and arrogant and believed that nobody would ever be desperate enough to steal from her. The kitchen was empty at this hour. 4:17 in the afternoon. The house staff had been dismissed early because Sophie was hosting a dinner party tonight, and servants were not meant to exist when guests arrived. Aria climbed the back stairs, her footsteps soft on the carpeted treads, carrying Emma upward through the sleeping mansion. Emma's breath caught against her neck, wet and labored. Every second that passed was a second the infection was winning. The converted closet that was Aria's bedroom waited on the 5th floor, a room so small that Aria could touch both walls if she stretched her arms straight out. A single mattress on the floor. A blanket her own mother had sewn, 20 years dead and still keeping her warm. A window the size of a dinner plate that looked out onto the city lights. She laid Emma down on that mattress, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The child's eyes fluttered, unfocused. "Vivi," Emma whispered. Vivi was what she called her. Short for Vivian, because Emma had heard it once and decided that was Aria's true name. "I am here," Aria said. "I am right here." She soaked a washcloth in cold water from the bathroom sink, a risk, sneaking down the hallway, praying that nobody would emerge from behind the heavy doors, and pressed it to Emma's forehead. The child's body shook with chills, muscle spasms racking through her small frame. Aria had no medicine. She had no phone to call for help. She had a $5 bill in her pocket that needed to last for groceries and bus fare and the deposit to the landlord that she could not possibly make. And she had 7 days before the eviction notice with red ink numbers became a legal reality. She had Emma. That was all. Across the city, in the climate-controlled office on the 42nd floor of the Castelliano building, Aleandro Castelliano watched security footage on repeat. 18 months of footage. 18 months of his daughter's face burned into every camera in this city, every database, every desperate plea sent to cops who took bribes instead of helping. He was a man of 48 years with silver threading his dark hair, with eyes the color of winter storms. He wore a suit that cost more than a month of most people's rent, the fabric so fine it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A scar ran from his right cheekbone to his jaw, a white line that made people look away. A gold watch on his left wrist. A ring on his right hand bearing a crest that meant loyalty until death. He sat very still, his hands folded on the mahogany desk, and watched his daughter's face disappear. "Play it again," he said to Tony, who stood beside the screen with his shoulders curved inward like a man carrying tremendous weight. Tony's jaw clenched. "Boss. Play it." The footage showed a black van pulling up outside the warehouse on Newport Street. His own brother, Marco, stepping out. His own blood handing Emma to a man in sunglasses. Emma crying, her small fists pounding against a stranger's chest, calling for her father while his brother watched without emotion. That was 14 months ago. Since then, they had found nothing. The man in sunglasses had vanished. Marco had vanished. Emma had vanished. And Aleandro had spent 500 days descending into a quiet rage that made grown men tremble at the sound of his voice. "Gino is outside," Tony said quietly. "He has news from the street." Aleandro closed his eyes. He did not sleep anymore. Sleep required the ability to surrender, and he had surrendered his capacity for surrender the day they took his daughter. Gino entered without knocking, a massive man with the shoulders of someone who had survived things that should have killed him. His suit was the color of charcoal, his shirt pressed to a knife's edge. He stood in front of the desk like a soldier reporting to a general. "We found a girl," Gino said. Same description. Age 7, dark hair, scar on her left cheek. She was seen 3 days ago at the Lincoln Avenue shelter. A volunteer mentioned she went missing from there yesterday afternoon. The silence in the room became absolute. Even the ambient hum of the city 42 stories below seemed to pause. "Describe the volunteer," Aleandro said. "A woman. Mid-20s. Works at the Langford mansion as a nanny." Gino paused. He was a careful man who did not speak without certainty. She visited the shelter on her one day off. The children called her Vivi. Aleandro stood very slowly, the chair rolling backward without sound. He walked to the window, looking out over Las Vegas sprawled beneath him like a map written in neon and greed. Somewhere in that city was a child with his eyes. And somewhere else was a woman he had never met, who had held his daughter's hand. He did not yet know that this woman would change everything. He did not yet know that tonight, when he finally found her, he would see not a servant or a criminal but a person willing to die for someone who was not her own blood. He did not yet know that her name was Aria Hartley, and that she possessed something rarer than power, rarer than money, rarer than anything he had ever owned. But the hunting had begun. And before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning, to understand how a woman with $5 and nowhere to go became the only person standing between a crime boss's daughter and death. The clock in the Langford mansion kitchen read 5:02 a.m. when Aria Hartley's eyes snapped open in the darkness. Not because an alarm sounded. Because her body had learned to wake before dawn, in the converted closet that measured 6 feet by 8 feet, in the penthouse on the 42nd floor of a building that cost more than her entire bloodline would ever earn. She did not move immediately. She lay there on the twin mattress, listening to the silence of Las Vegas sleeping below, and counted her breaths like they were currency she was rationing. $5. That was everything. Crumpled in her jeans pocket downstairs were 5 $1 bills, and they were supposed to last until Friday. It was Tuesday. The eviction notice sat on her nightstand, the red ink numbers screaming at her every time she opened her eyes, $22,000. Due in 7 days. The apartment she did not even live in anymore, a studio with black mold creeping up the bathroom wall, would be seized on the 15th. Not that it mattered. She had not slept there in 11 months. She had been living in this closet instead, trading her freedom for a roof and a salary that looked generous until you did the mathematics of desperation. Aria rolled out of bed and dressed in darkness. Black slacks. White blouse. Hair pulled so tight it made her temples ache. She was 28 years old but looked 37, the kind of aging that comes not from time but from carrying weight no single person should carry. Her mother in Columbus, Ohio, was in hospice now. Congestive heart failure. The hospital bills had climbed past $90,000. Aria sent what she could, sometimes $200, sometimes $50, sometimes nothing, and her mother never asked where it came from. The kitchen was a cathedral of marble and stainless steel. Aria moved through it like a ghost, like she had been programmed to take up no space, to displace no air. The coffee maker gurgled. She prepared bottles for the twins, for Marcus and Lily, ages 5 and 3, warming formula to exactly 98.6 degrees, which was the temperature Sophie Langford demanded. Not 98.5. Not 99. 98.6, measured with a digital thermometer, or Sophie would notice and Aria would pay for that error in small cuts, in privileges withdrawn, in hours added to her 14-hour day. The water in the sink was so hot it turned her hands red. At 6:15 a.m., Sophie Langford descended the marble staircase in a white silk robe that probably cost more than Aria's yearly salary. She was 42, blonde, sculpted by personal trainers and dermatologists into something that looked human but moved like a mechanism. Her eyes were the color of ice water. She did not greet Aria. She simply appeared, the way predators appeared, suddenly, and with intention. "The bottles are ready," Aria said, her voice barely a whisper, like a candle trying to burn in a wind tunnel. Sophie picked up one of the bottles and held it to her own wrist, checking the temperature. The gesture was not affectionate. It was an inspection. "You were awake last night. I heard movement in the pantry at 11 p.m. Aria's stomach became a stone. "I was making bottles for..." "This is my house," Sophie said, her voice smooth as poison. "You sleep when I allow it. You move when I allow it. You exist when I allow it. Do you understand?" "Yes. Look at me when I speak to you." Aria lifted her eyes. This was a test. Sophie was watching to see if Aria would meet her gaze or if she would flinch. Aria had learned to do something in between, look at the space just above Sophie's shoulder, a technique that created the illusion of eye contact while protecting some small, invisible part of herself from Sophie's inspection. Sophie reached out. Her manicured fingers, still holding the bottle, brushed against the inside of Aria's left wrist. Aria's arm had bruises there, purple fading to yellow, finger marks that belonged to someone else. Douglas. 2 days ago, in the parking lot of the Lincoln Avenue homeless shelter on her one free afternoon each week, he had grabbed her hard enough to leave a map of his hands on her skin. "What happened here?" Sophie asked, and her voice had shifted into something that sounded almost concerned. This was worse than cruelty. Cruelty was honest. This false concern was a knife with its edge turned backward. "Did you hurt yourself?" "I bumped into a door," Aria said. Sophie smiled. How clumsy. Her fingers pressed slightly harder into the bruises, and Aria felt the pressure like teeth. "You need to be more careful. The children depend on you." "Yes." Sophie released her wrist and set the bottle down with precision. "The twins need breakfast at 7 a.m. Then Lily has her pediatrician appointment at 9. You will have her ready. And tonight, Robert and I are attending the Chambers Gala. You will stay with the children until my mother arrives at 7 p.m. She will stay until we return. You are not to sleep until we leave." Aria nodded. This meant she would be awake for 19 hours. This was not unusual. Sophie turned and left the kitchen, and the space she had occupied seemed to warm slightly, as if she had been cold rather than warm. By 9 a.m., Aria was pushing Lily in a stroller through the parking lot of Sunrise Medical Plaza. The October sun was already heating the asphalt, and the air smelled like car exhaust and distant rain. Lily was humming to herself, a sound like a small bird, completely unaware that the woman pushing her would go hungry so that the hospital in Ohio could get another payment. Completely unaware that the woman pushing her was terrified. 2 weeks ago, Aria had filed a police report. Officer Morrison, a man with a thick mustache and small eyes, had listened to her account of Douglas's text messages, the photographs he had somehow taken from inside the penthouse, his threats. Morrison had written nothing down. "Look," he said, leaning back in his chair, "Douglas Hale is a good guy. Works security downtown. I know him from the gym." "You probably just misunderstood something he said. Women sometimes do that when they're emotional." Aria had tried again. "He followed me to the shelter last week. He grabbed my arm." "Did he hit you?" "No, but..." "Then there's nothing I can do. Come back when he actually harms you. And maybe don't go places alone at night. That's just common sense." He had filed the report anyway, because that was procedure, but she had seen him close the file folder with a gesture that meant he would never open it again. The pediatrician's office was cool and smelled like antiseptic. Aria sat in a waiting room with 6 other people, other nannies, other young women whose job was to hold children that did not belong to them, and her phone buzzed. A text message from a number she knew by heart, a number she had tried to block 6 times and Douglas had kept unblocking through some technical method she did not understand. The message said, "You can't hide from me forever." Below it was a photograph. Her closet. The narrow bed. Her pillow. Taken from inside the penthouse, from inside the room where she slept. The image meant something specific. It meant he had been in that space. It meant he could do it again. Her hands began to shake. Lily emerged from the doctor's office 20 minutes later, healthy and chattering, completely oblivious to the fact that the person caring for her was slowly transforming into something made of fear and silence and $5. But what kept Aria moving, what made her endure the 14-hour days and Sophie's inspections and Douglas's escalating threats, was Sunday. Every Sunday was her one free afternoon, from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., and she spent every minute of it at the Lincoln Avenue shelter on the edge of downtown. The shelter smelled like industrial cleaner and wet wool. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a way that made your skull vibrate if you stood under them too long. There were 43 children at the Lincoln Avenue shelter on average, ranging in age from 3 months to 17 years. Most were there with siblings. Some were there with parents who had run out of places to go. Some were there because the system had misplaced them, and no one knew how to find them again. Emma was 7 years old and had not spoken in the entire time Aria had known her. Dark curly hair. Large brown eyes. A scar on her left cheek shaped like a crescent moon. She never participated in the group activities. Never took a toy from the box. Never raised her hand during story time. But on Aria's 3rd visit, 6 months ago, Emma had walked directly to where Aria was sitting and climbed into her lap. Now, on this Tuesday that was supposed to be 4 days away from Sunday but felt like an eternity, Aria thought about Emma. She thought about the way Emma's hands were always cold, even on warm days. She thought about the pictures Emma drew, always the same picture, of a large house with bars on the windows and a figure standing outside. She thought about the day she had brought crackers from the Langford kitchen, stolen in a napkin, and Emma had eaten them so slowly that Aria realized the child was rationing every single bite, understanding on some level that you could not trust abundance to last. Aria did not know who Emma was. She did not know that Emma had a name before she was Emma, a name she was forbidden to speak because speaking it might kill the woman with kind eyes. She did not know that Emma had been carried away in the night 18 months ago, hidden in a network that moved through shelters like rats through walls, passed from one captor to another. She did not know that Emma's silence was not trauma but training. All Aria knew was that on Sunday she would see Emma again, and Emma would sit in her lap, and for 3 hours Aria would pretend that the world was not a machine designed to break people like them. The clock on the Langford penthouse wall ticked toward evening. Aria had been awake for 17 hours. Her eyes felt like they had sand beneath the eyelids. Her feet ached in a way that traveled up her spine. She bathed the twins and dressed them for bed, kissing their foreheads, breathing in the smell of their baby shampoo, and somewhere inside her chest something that had not broken yet tried very hard not to. Sophie's mother arrived at 7 p.m. The door to Aria's closet remained closed, just as it always did when the family was home. The October wind cut through the lodge like a blade wrapped in ice as Aria knelt on the kitchen floor, her hands trembling as she gathered the shattered pieces of Sophie's wine glass. Each shard caught the light, glinting red like blood. Her fingers were bleeding, she didn't remember cutting them, but the blood was there, mixing with the spilled wine, turning the tile floor into something that looked like a crime scene. She thought distantly that perhaps it was a crime scene of her own making. She had stolen a child, hidden her, risked everything, and in doing so, she had destroyed the fragile existence she had spent 2 years building. Behind her, unheard, Aleandro Castellano stood in the kitchen doorway. He had come down the back stairs looking for water for Emma. Instead, he had found a woman on her knees, bleeding, picking up the pieces of a glass that his associate's wife, the woman who employed her, who held her poverty like a weapon, had thrown in rage. He had heard every word from upstairs. Sophie's voice rising through the floorboards like poison. The words nobody, repeated 3 times. The prediction that he would discard Aria when he was finished with her, the way a man discards a toy. Aleandro did not move. He simply stood there, watching the trembling of Aria's hands, the way she flinched every time a shard cut deeper into her palm. The way she did not cry. The way she simply kept cleaning, kept gathering, kept existing even though the world had made it clear that her existence was inconvenient. Something in his chest, something that had been locked away, frozen solid for 18 months, began to crack. He had received a call 18 months ago. A simple message, "Your daughter is gone." Gone. The word had meant nothing at first. Gone to school. Gone to a friend's house. His mind could not process the other meaning, the one his instinct screamed at him. Gone. Taken. Dead. His brother Marco, jealous, vicious, had orchestrated it. A punishment for Aleandro's refusal to let him deeper into the family business. Marco had wanted power. When Aleandro refused, Marco had taken the only thing that mattered. Emma. For 547 days, Aleandro had not slept. He had moved through the city like a ghost, methodical and merciless. He had followed every lead, interrogated hundreds of people, spent $4 million searching for her. His men whispered that he was losing his mind. That grief was rotting him from the inside. Tony had tried to convince him that Emma was dead, that mercy would be to let her go. Aleandro had simply looked at Tony and said, "If you ever speak that word again, I will remove your tongue." And then, this morning, his informant had called. A child matching Emma's description. The Langford estate. And Aleandro had felt something he thought had died inside him, hope. What he had not expected was to find her alive. What he had not expected was to find her in the arms of a woman who wore poverty like a second skin, a woman who knelt on a kitchen floor and bled without complaint, a woman who loved a child that was not hers with a ferocity that made Aleandro remember what love looked like when it was not twisted by power and darkness. He stepped into the kitchen. The sound of his footstep on the tile, measured, deliberate, made Aria's spine go rigid. She did not turn around. She knew, somehow, that it was him. The air in the room had changed. The temperature had dropped. The space had become smaller even though the kitchen was large and open. "Leave it," Aleandro said. His voice was deep, solid like an oath, but underneath was something else. Something breaking. Aria turned slowly. Her hands were shaking. Blood dripped from her right palm onto the white tile. She looked at him, this man who was larger than the room itself, who wore a black wool coat like armor, whose eyes had seen things that would destroy ordinary people. She looked at him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She was nobody. She had stolen his daughter. She deserved whatever came next. Aleandro crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took her bleeding hand in his. His hands were warm. Impossibly warm. He turned her palm upward and examined the cuts without speaking. A line of blood ran down her wrist, disappearing beneath the cuff of her thin cardigan. He reached for a clean towel from the counter, wrapped her hand with such gentleness that it made something in her chest collapse. "You should have called 911, he said finally. "When you found her at the shelter. You should have called the police." "She begged me not to," Aria whispered. She was so afraid. Of what? Of being taken back. I didn't understand, but she was terrified, and I couldn't leave her alone. Aleandro held her wrapped hand between both of his and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something ancient and dangerous was looking out at her. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Aria said. "Mrs. Langford has spoken about you. And yet you stole my daughter. I didn't know she was yours. I only knew she needed help." He studied her face for so long that the silence became something physical. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the wind against the windows upstairs where Emma slept, finally resting without fever. She could hear the faint sound of a car engine starting somewhere outside. "My daughter was taken from me," Aleandro said quietly. 18 months ago. She was taken by someone I trusted. Someone in my own family. For 547 days, I did not know if she was alive or dead. I burned half this city looking for her. I would have burned all of it. Aria's eyes filled with tears. She understood suddenly the shape of his grief, the weight of it. She understood why he had knelt beside Emma like a man praying at an altar. "I found her because of you," he continued. "My men came to this lodge because you were here. You saved her life. You kept her warm when she was burning with fever. You gave her something I have not been able to give her for a year and a half, safety." "I'm sorry," Aria said, though she didn't know what she was apologizing for. Being poor. Being nobody. Loving a child that wasn't hers. Existing in a way that threatened the careful boundaries of other people's worlds. "You are not sorry," Aleandro said. "And neither am I." A phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He removed it, glanced at the screen, his expression hardening into something carved from stone. He handed her the phone. On the screen was the text thread from Douglas Hale. 17 messages, each one darker than the last. The final message read, "I'm at the bottom of the mountain. Your boyfriend isn't there to protect you. Let me guess, you traded up. Running to the mafia now? I'll drag you down screaming before I let another man touch what's mine." Aria's blood went cold. She had told Douglas there was nothing between her and this man, this employer, this stranger who had become something she couldn't name. She had told him she was just a nanny, living in a closet, nobody of importance. But Douglas had never believed in her invisibility. Douglas believed in his own ownership. For 2 years, he had believed that she belonged to him, that her body and her choices and her future were his to control. "How did he find me?" she whispered. "It doesn't matter," Aleandro said. He turned away from her and pressed the phone to his ear. "Tony." "Yes. I see it." He paused, listening to something she couldn't hear. "Do it now. Clean. Nothing that traces back to us." Another pause. "I don't care where. I don't care how. I want him gone before sunrise." He ended the call and turned back to her. In his eyes was the man who controlled half of Nevada. The man who could erase people from existence and sleep peacefully. But underneath that, in the small lines around his mouth, in the slight tremor of his hands when he reached toward her face, was the man who had knelt crying beside his daughter. "He will never touch you again," Aleandro said. "He will never find you again. By morning, it will be as if he never existed." "You can't just," Aria started, but he held up one hand, silencing her. "Yes," he said simply. "I can. And I will. Because you looked at my daughter when she was a stranger to you, and you loved her more than your own safety. I do not forget debts like that." Outside, the wind howled down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow. Somewhere on the highway below, Douglas Hale was driving toward them, toward vengeance, toward a violence that would never arrive, because Aleandro Castellano had already set other forces in motion, forces that would meet him in the darkness and end him so completely that no one would ever know what had happened. But in the kitchen of the mountain lodge, wrapped in the heat of a man's attention, Aria Hartley remained exactly where she was. She did not run. She did not hide. She simply stood there as Aleandro bandaged her bleeding hand with the tenderness of someone who had been learning, all over again, how to touch the world without destroying it. The headlights cut through the October blizzard like two blades through silk, and the pickup truck shuddered to a stop outside the mountain lodge. Douglas Hale stepped into the wind with his security company jacket zipped tight, his face twisted into something that looked like righteousness but tasted like rage. Behind him came Detective Morrison in full uniform, his badge catching the porch light, and two more officers whose names Aria would never learn because they were already ghosts, already erased, already complicit in something they didn't understand. Tony and Gino moved to intercept, their hands loose at their sides in that particular way that meant they were calculating distances and trajectories, but Aleandro raised one hand and they stepped back. "Let them knock," he said. His voice was soft, which meant the violence was already arranged, already in motion, already inevitable. Sophie Langford had been waiting for this moment like a predator waits for blood in the water. The moment someone opened the door, she would point at Aria and say, "Officers, thank God you're here. That woman kidnapped a child and has been hiding in my home," and everything would collapse. She had called the police herself an hour ago, had given them the false documents that Detective Morrison now held in his trembling hand, documents bearing the signature of a judge who had retired 6 months prior, each letter a forgery, each stamp a lie. The pounding on the lodge door sounded like the end of something. Aria stood near the fireplace in the great room, her borrowed sweater hanging loose on her frame, her hair pulled back with a rubber band because she owned nothing better. Emma was upstairs sleeping, still recovering from pneumonia, her small lungs finally moving air without the rattling sound that had kept Aria awake for 5 nights straight. The child had lived. Against every odd, against every circumstance, Emma had lived because a woman with $5 in her pocket had chosen to stay. Sophie opened the door. The cold swept in like a living thing, carrying snow and wind and the smell of diesel exhaust. Behind it came Douglas Hale, his eyes finding Aria across the room with the precision of something predatory, something that had been hunting for 2 years and finally located its prey. His mouth twisted upward. "There you are," he said. "I've been looking everywhere. You're coming with me. Now." Aria's voice emerged from somewhere very far away. "I have a restraining order against you." Douglas laughed, a sound like glass breaking inside water. "That expired," he said. "But I have a new one against you. Kidnapping. Child endangerment. You're under arrest." He pulled a document from his jacket pocket, held it up like a trophy, and the word swam in Aria's vision because she understood with sudden, crushing clarity that he had corrupted the system itself. The police had come for her. The law had come for her. There was nowhere left to run. Detective Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt, his expression carefully neutral in that way that meant he already knew the papers were false and didn't care. "We need you to come with us, Miss Hartley," he said. "This can go easy or hard, but you're coming." Douglas crossed the room in 4 strides and grabbed her wrist. His fingers found the exact spot where the bruises from last time still lingered, yellow-green ghosts beneath her skin. "You don't get to help anyone," he said. "You don't get to make choices. You're mine." The room emptied of sound except for the wind outside and the crackling of the fireplace. Aria's mind went white and still like a frozen lake. 2 years of running. 2 years of changing her number, sleeping in her car, hiding in the closet of a penthouse, eating leftovers from garbage cans, working 14-hour days for money she could never keep. And here, in front of witnesses, in front of police, none of it mattered. He had decided she was his property, and the law had agreed to enforce that decision. She thought of the eviction notice. She thought of $5 in her pocket. She thought about how invisibility was not protection, it was just another way of being erased. Then Emma's small hand slipped into hers. The child had come downstairs despite the fever that still made her skin hot to the touch, despite the weakness that made each step a small act of courage. She was holding Aria's hand with the grip of someone who had learned, over 5 nights of being nursed through pneumonia, that staying meant something. Her voice was tiny but clear. "You stayed with me," Emma said. "I'll stay with you." That was when Aleandro Castellano stepped between them. He moved like gravity, like inevitability, like a man who had spent 18 months learning how to destroy things finally finding something worth protecting. His presence filled the room the way darkness fills a cave, not through brightness but through the absence of any space for anything else. When he looked at Douglas Hale, his eyes were two pieces of grey stone. "Remove your hand from her," Aleandro said. "Now." Douglas went very still. "Who the hell are you?" Detective Morrison's hand moved toward his belt. "Mr. Castellano, this is a police matter." "This is my house," Aleandro said. "My territory. And you are trespassing with fraudulent documents." He gestured toward the paper Morrison held. "The judge who signed that retired 6 months ago. Your document is fake. You know it." Morrison knew it. The officers knew it. Everyone in the room knew it except for the lie that had been constructed so carefully, so deliberately, with such certainty of success that it had begun to feel like truth. "She's my girlfriend," Douglas said, his voice cracking. "She ran away and I'm taking her back." "She is not your anything," Aleandro said. "And you are leaving?" "In pieces if necessary." Douglas moved with the desperation of a man who understood he had made a terrible mistake. His hand went to his jacket pocket and emerged with a handgun, not licensed, not registered, purchased through channels that existed in the shadows where men like him conducted their business. He pointed it at Aria's chest. "I'll kill her before I let her go," he said. 12 men in black emerged from the architecture of the lodge like they had been waiting in the walls. 2 from behind the kitchen counter, disarming Douglas in movement so efficient that his gun clattered across the hardwood floor before his brain registered that he had lost it. 4 more descended the stairs, surrounding the officers who suddenly understood that they had walked into territory that belonged to someone far more dangerous than themselves. 2 stood at every exit. 2 more appeared in the doorway that led to the kitchen. 12 men who had been positioned since the moment the pickup truck appeared on the security cameras 3 miles away. Douglas collapsed onto his knees. His body shook like a cornered animal. "Please," he said. "I didn't mean it. I was just scared. Please don't hurt me." Tony stepped forward, his movements casual, his voice soft. "Mr. Hale, you've been making threats against someone under Mr. Castellano's protection. That's unfortunate for you." "I'll leave," Douglas gasped. "I swear I'll never come back." "Please." Gino shook his head. "Too late for that," he said. "But don't worry. You're not our problem anymore. You're theirs." The front door opened and 3 more men entered from the blizzard. But these did not belong to Aleandro Castellano. They belonged to the Salazar family, the organization that had been waiting for years for Castellano to give them a gift wrapped in Douglas Hale's skin. They moved with the relaxed confidence of men who knew exactly what would happen next. "Mr. Hale here has been stalking a woman under my protection, assaulting her, and threatening her life," Aleandro said. "He also falsified police documents and brought corrupt officers onto my property. I'm told the Salazar family has creative methods for handling men who prey on women." The Salazar lieutenant smiled. "Very creative, Mr. Castellano." Douglas realized what was about to happen. The color drained from his face. "No," he said. No, you can't do this. I have rights." "You gave up your rights when you put your hands on her," Tony said. They took him screaming into the blizzard. His voice cut through the wind for exactly 13 seconds before the truck doors slammed and the engine started. By morning, the snow had covered his footprints. By the next week, Aria would learn that Douglas Hale had survived 3 days with the Salazar enforcers before he told them everything, and that his body had never been recovered because the desert kept its secrets and asked no questions. But Aleandro was not finished. He turned to Sophie Langford, who had been backing slowly toward the stairs, her face draining of color as she understood that she had become a convenience to be disposed of. "Mrs. Langford," he said, "you've been embezzling from the shelter where Emma was hidden. $730,000 over 3 years, routed through your husband's construction company." "That's insane," Sophie said. "I've never." "I have the bank records," Aleandro said. Every transaction dated, every wire documented, every connection traced. Tomorrow morning, the FBI will have copies of everything. You're also guilty of child endangerment. You knew Emma was kidnapped. You used her to manipulate Aria. And you allowed a violent man onto this property with a weapon. That's federal prison. 40 years minimum. Sophie's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the stairs, her body racked with sobs. Please, she said. I have children. I'll lose everything. You should have thought of that before you called a woman pathetic for saving a child's life, Aleandro said. The FBI arrived at dawn. Sophie Langford was arrested in her nightgown, led from the lodge in handcuffs while news cameras captured everything. Her husband filed for divorce within a week. Her assets were frozen. Her name became synonymous with corruption and cruelty. 40 years. Federal prison. Complete systematic destruction. But what Aria did not understand as she stood in the lodge watching the snow fall and the police lights fade into the storm was that Aleandro Castellano had just burned every bridge he had with law enforcement, had handed a man to his worst enemies, and had destroyed a prominent family, all because a woman with $5 in her pocket had loved his daughter enough to risk everything. The wind howled down from the mountains, and in that sound was the echo of something changing. Something breaking open. Something that could never be repaired because it had been broken deliberately, by choice, for a reason that transcended law. The October wind cuts across the rooftop balcony like a blade wrapped in ice, and Aria Hartley stands alone at the edge of the Las Vegas skyline, the city lights spreading below her like fallen stars scattered across black velvet. She is 28 years old now, but the hardness has softened from her face. Her dark hair falls past her shoulders, clean and shining in a way it never did when she was counting pennies in a converted closet. Her hands, no longer calloused from 14-hour workdays, rest against the glass railing. She wears a modest grey dress, simple and elegant, purchased with money she earned herself. The lights of the city blur slightly as her eyes grow distant, remembering. 1 year has passed in silence. 12 months since that blizzard morning when Emma was carried away and Sophie Langford was led from the lodge in handcuffs. 12 months since Aria watched Douglas Hale disappear into Aleandro's men like smoke dissolving into winter air. 12 months of waiting for retribution that never came, for a knock on the door that stayed closed, for the kind smile of the crime boss who burned everything to keep her safe and then vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The first thing she discovered, in January, was the anonymous payment. $22,000, transferred to her mother's medical debt account. The hospital called her directly. The balance has been cleared in full, they said. Your mother is free. She had wept in her car for 2 hours that afternoon, her shoulders shaking, unable to comprehend a kindness so vast it seemed impossible. A week later came the key. No letter, no explanation. Just a manila envelope with an address written in precise handwriting and a key that opened a rent-controlled apartment in a neighborhood where people did not get mugged at night and the locks actually worked. First year's rent was paid. Her name was on the lease. She could stay. She moved in February, on a day when the desert sun was warm enough to feel like forgiveness. The private school hired her in the same month. $48,000 a year. Benefits. Sick leave. A retirement plan. She taught children whose parents were doctors and lawyers and business owners, children who had never known hunger, and she loved them with a ferocity that surprised her. In her classroom, pinned to the bulletin board, was the drawing Emma had made before everything fell apart. A woman with kind eyes. Words written in careful letters beneath, Vivi help me. Vivi stay. She had not told anyone who Vivi was. By June, she had paid off the last of her personal debt. $3,000 owed to medical providers, $2,000 to a collection agency. Gone. She was standing in her apartment one evening, holding an empty folder, and she realized that for the first time since she was 17 years old, she owed nothing to anyone. September came with the first piece of furniture that was hers. Not second-hand. Not borrowed. Not salvaged. A kitchen table, small and simple, made of solid oak, costing $680 that she had saved from 3 months of paychecks. She ran her hand across the surface and remembered the converted closet, the bare floor, the nights she slept sitting up because there was nowhere else to lie down. She wept again, but this time the tears tasted like peace instead of desperation. Now, on October 16th, exactly 1 year after the storm, she stands on this rooftop balcony overlooking the city. She works here now, tutoring the children of a CEO in the penthouse. Her own small office overlooks the entire valley. She finishes her shift at 7 in the evening, and before she leaves, she always comes to this balcony for 3 minutes. 3 minutes to breathe the dry October air and remember that she survived. She does not hear him approach. The cold deepens first. She feels it before she sees it, a shift in the air, the way a room changes when a door opens to winter. Then footsteps, deliberate and slow, crossing the rooftop behind her. Aria turns, and the breath stops in her chest. Aleandro Castellano stands at the threshold between inside and outside, wearing the same black wool coat from a year ago, tailored to perfection, worth more than everything she owns combined. He has aged slightly in 12 months. There is more grey at his temples, more weariness in the set of his shoulders. But his eyes are exactly as she remembers them, storm grey and penetrating, carrying the weight of 18 months of searching for a daughter and the knowledge of all he has done since finding her. "Mr. Castellano," she whispers. Her voice is barely audible, trembling like a candle in wind. He does not smile. He does not move. He simply watches her with an expression so complex that she cannot read it. "I've been looking for you," he says. His voice is deep and solid like an oath. "Why?" The word escapes before she can think. "Because I owed you the truth. And I've been carrying it for a year." He takes one step toward her. Then another. The distance between them narrows to something impossible, something charged with the weight of everything they are not supposed to be. "Emma is thriving," he says. "Healthy. In school." She laughs now, Aria. She actually laughs. She draws pictures of a woman with kind eyes who saved her life. "That woman is you." Aria's throat tightens. She cannot speak. "My brother Dante was found 6 months ago," Aleandro continues, his voice never changing its measured cadence. "I had to choose between mercy and survival. I chose survival. I have not slept well since." He moves closer. Close enough that she can see the scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone, a permanent map of violence and loss. "For 18 months after Emma was taken, I was a ghost. Numb. Full of rage. I destroyed rivals and allies alike searching for her. My men were terrified of me. They should have been." The wind picks up, carrying the sound of the city beneath them, 10,000 voices reduced to a low murmur. "But the night I found you kneeling in that closet with Emma burning in your arms," he says, whispering prayers in the cold, "I understood something I had forgotten. You saved not just my daughter. You saved the part of me that my brother's betrayal had killed. You reminded me what love looks like when it has no agenda, no conditions, no price." Aria's eyes are shining with tears. "I didn't do anything special," she says, her voice breaking. "I just couldn't leave her." "That's exactly why it mattered," Aleandro responds. His voice is lower now, rougher. "Anyone else would have walked away. You stayed. That makes you the bravest person I have ever met, because you had nothing and gave everything." He reaches out. His fingers touch her face, gentle as prayer, and his thumb traces away a tear that has already fallen. "You were never nobody, Aria. I need you to understand that. The world tried to convince you that you were invisible, disposable, worthless. But I saw you. I have always seen you." She breathes, and the October cold fills her lungs. "Emma asks about you every day," he continues. "Where is Vivi? When will Vivi come back? And every time she asks, I remember what you did. I think about it every time I make a choice between cruelty and mercy. You taught me that again. Why are you telling me this now?" Aria asks. Because you deserve to know that your kindness was not wasted. That it changed everything. That a woman with $5 in her pocket and 14-hour days behind her is the kind of person the world tries to break. And I refuse to let that happen. I've spent the last year ensuring no one ever tries again. The city lights shift slightly as clouds pass overhead. I will spend the rest of my life ensuring that no one ever takes your survival for granted again, Aleandro says. Because you matter. You have always mattered. The storm will pass, and you are far stronger than you think. The wind carries away his final words, scattering them across the desert like a prayer answered after waiting a lifetime. And in that moment, standing on a rooftop above Las Vegas, Aria Hartley understands that kindness is not weakness. That survival measured in dollars is not the only kind of survival that matters. That sometimes the smallest acts of courage echo farther than anyone can predict, changing everything about who we become and who we love. If this story reminded you that kindness is not weakness, drop a like right now. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their survival matters. Subscribe and turn on notifications because tomorrow we're bringing you another story about people who refuse to break when the world tried to crush them. Comment below, have you ever made a choice to help someone when you had nothing left to give? Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear today. We'll see you in the next one. Stay strong.